Hello and welcome. My name is Ramona Gheorghe and I'm a graduate student in the Master of Nursing program at Ryerson University. I have the pleasure and the honor to be joined by researcher and educator, Dr. Jasna Schwind, and two of my colleagues, Emma MacGregor and Chantelle Walker. Thank you so much for joining me. We are here today to have a conversation about the topic I'm very interested in learning more about, the narrative reflective process, usually referred by its acronym NRP. NRP is a creative self-expression tool created by Dr. Schwind, which incorporates metaphors, storytelling, drawing, creative writing, and reflective dialogue. NRP is an approach that can assist us in learning more about ourselves through deep reflection by helping us getting in touch with our tacit knowing. NRP supports personal and professional development, education and research, and could be used by any discipline. I learned about NRP while taking a qualitative research course with Dr. Schwind last year. And I remember that I was fascinated and perplexed at the same time. Fascinated about the many ways one can engage in reflection with the NRP, and I was perplexed why so little is known about it. In my clinical practice, for example, in discussion with my colleagues, I was surprised to see that nobody heard of this tool. And it was at that time I promised myself that I would do something about it in order to share this valuable knowledge with others. I became passionate about NRP and eager to discover more. Moreover, last year, I also learned about Carper's 1978 Patterns of Knowing, Empirics, Ethics, Personal, and Aesthetic, and later Emancipatory Knowing, which was added by Chin and Kramer in 2019. I remember it was during that time that I had an aha moment about NRP, about how NRP can be useful in developing personal and aesthetic knowing in practice. I became empowered by the richness of all these ways of knowing, which I realized I possess. As I'm interested in learning more about different ways of accessing my tacit knowledge, I came to recognize that the narrative reflective process is a suitable tool to help me achieve this goal. In fact, the creative nature of NRP supports personal and professional development, expanding as a result my personal and aesthetic ways of knowing. I think about NRP as a vital tool for one's practice, one that plays such a significant role in education, research, and practice. My hope for our conversation today is to offer our respective experiences of engaging with narrative reflective process in order to provide more information to anyone new to NRP. Students, educators, researchers, and other healthcare professionals and practitioners. I believe that understanding the NRP process will help them embrace it with curiosity and creativity, both in their personal and professional lives. Let's start at the beginning. Dr. Schwind, would you please share with us how the narrative reflective process came to life? What inspired you to create this tool?
Thank you, Ramona, for that question. So for my doctoral study, I was introduced to narrative inquiry, a qualitative research method innovated by two educators and researchers, Dr. Michael Conley and Dr. Jean Clendenin in the late 1980s. The narrative inquiry method allows us to investigate in a scholarly manner the lived experience. In other words, the inquirer or the researcher explores in greater depth and breadth the experience articulated by the individual through stories of that experience. Narrative inquiry is philosophically informed by the pragmatist scholar John Dewey, who wrote that each and every experience informs the quality of every subsequent experience. And that experience is social, meaning it happens in relationship, and it takes place in a particular situation or a series of situations. Experience is lived, and as such, it is an ontological event. In order for us to understand and learn from the experience, which means to move it to the epistemological dimension, we tell stories of these experiences. We think of storytelling, however, as being verbally articulated, as being told orally from one person to another or to a group of people. So we tell a story. But there are other ways that we can also access our lived experiences. For example, we can draw, paint, sculpt, dance. Use any creative self-expression approach that allows our experience as embodied knowing to be brought forth into our present moment consciousness, our epistemological dimension. At this point, the experience or event can be deconstructed, reflected upon, and then reconstructed with new meaning in place, thus opening for us greater options for our future ways of being, thinking, and doing. Philosopher Michael Polanyi claimed that we know more than we can say. And I too subscribe to that conviction. I use the metaphor of an iceberg to make sense of Polanyi's claim. The small part of the iceberg that is above the sea level is similar to our conscious ability to verbally articulate what we know. The iceberg that is below the sea level, for me, represents our vast inner knowing. Some will call it wisdom, while others will refer to it as our subconscious. Polanyi called it our tacit knowing. It is that part of us that we can first access through the embodied creative self-expression to access new concepts before we form sufficient understanding and be able to articulate it verbally outward to ourselves and to others. In addition to the embodied creative self-expression, I also use in my teaching, research, and practice metaphors or symbolic images that best represent for me or my students or participants a particular situation, concept, or idea. So how does all this relate to the narrative reflective process? In my doctoral study, I explored 3 nurse educators' experiences of a serious personal illness. As I conducted narrative interviews with my co-participants, asking questions, they responded from a professional nursing perspective. I was basically hearing something akin to nurse's notes. At that point, I decided to move beyond the verbal interview and invite my co-participants to select a metaphor that best represents for them their illness experience. Then I asked them to draw that metaphor. And then following, I invited my co-participants to have their metaphor write them a letter. The outcome of this creative activity was a more fulsome depiction of my co-participants' experiences of being ill and of being patients who were also nurses, educators, and researchers. For ease of reference, I named the collective creative activities the narrative reflective process, specifically including mindful presence, storytelling, metaphors, drawing, creative writing, and reflective dialogue. It is important to note, however, that the narrative inquiry research method encourages the use of varied and creative approaches to collecting stories or data. This includes photo voice, artifacts, documents, and other creative venues. So before I hand it over back to you, Ramona, I want to mention that along with creative self-expression, reflection is a major part of the narrative reflective process. As John Dewey said, without some reconstruction, some remaking of our life experiences, there is no intellectual evolution. So, accessing our embodied experiences through creative self-expression and reflecting on these supports our own knowledge development, particularly our personal and aesthetic knowing, as Ramona, you had mentioned earlier in our conversation. And of course, these are two patterns of the four identified by the nurse researcher Dr. Barbara Carper in the late 1970s, and the other two patterns of being ethical and empirical knowing. And also, Ramona, as you mentioned, Drs. Chin and Kramer, who took Dr. Carper's work forward, added another very important pattern of knowing, the emancipatory knowing.
Mm-hmm. This is so inspiring and also so rich. Thank you so much for sharing this, Dr. Schwind. Now, Dr. Schwind, how can NRP be used for professional development?
Well, in terms of professional development, we can use NRP to explore various concepts, ideas, and situations. We can even explore our professional identity. For example, using the metaphor of self as instrument of care, we would select a metaphor that best represents for us who we are in our professional role, and then follow the steps of the NRP process, which are outlined in articles and chapters referenced at the end of this recording. It is also important to keep in mind that there is no right or wrong response. It is what it is for the person selecting the metaphor. By describing the metaphor, the individual learns more about aspects of themselves and thus gives themselves greater choice on how to engage in future events. We also need to think of the value of using aspects of the narrative reflective process when working with patients. For example, if working with very young patients or with those who speak a different language or are unable to speak for whatever reason, we could invite them to draw a symbolic image or metaphor of their illness or their feelings. It is important to remember that it is always the author of the creative self-expression who interprets that creation.
This is so beautiful and so true. How about education?
In teaching learning situations, I use a narrative reflective process to help students explore their relationship to the course, content, and the course itself, to consider their developing professional identity, or to grasp certain complex concepts in the course. So for these purposes, I often do metaphoric reflection, which is part of the NRP process, and that helps to focus in on what we are trying to accomplish. So we know that metaphors are bridges between concepts we are already familiar with and those we have not yet grasped. So using a particular part of the NRP helps us to achieve that goal.
And how about in research, in a research context?
When we speak of research, as I alluded to earlier, using narrative reflective process in collecting data allows for a more holistic approach to learning about the participants' lived and told experiences. One example comes to mind. Several years ago, I was conducting an interview with nursing students who went to Brazil for the summer to engage in public health activities with local healthcare practitioners. The traditional qualitative interview revealed indeed what they had done and what they had learned as developing professionals. However, when I engaged them in the narrative reflective process, we heard of the rich experiences they lived outside their assigned practice framework. We learned how they connected to the heart of the people or the clients they met, and how joy of life is not dependent on material wealth. They shared the life lessons that changed them, which they were able to express they were able to access and express through the creative activities of the narrative reflective process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwind, for sharing all these stories and experiences. They are very inspiring. Emma, how did you come to experience NRP? Could you please tell us about it?
Absolutely. I came to learn about NRP through reading the work of Dr. Schwind's thesis students, who used her NRP to explore a wide range of experiences with their co-participants: postpartum depression, nursing leadership, interprofessional collaboration, and childhood cancer, to name a few. At the time, I myself was crafting an outline for my thesis on women's first public exam experiences. I used the NRP metaphor reflection to begin writing my proposal, justifying my research from a personal stance. I experienced firsthand the meaning this activity evoked and instantly knew I wanted to use NRP in my arts-informed narrative inquiry study. Now, having finished it, I can say for sure that NRP allowed my co-participants, young women, to more fully express their stories of their first public exam experiences. It seemed to me that NRP allowed them to reflect more deeply on their experiences. Each of them selected their own metaphor to represent for them their experience, and this process allowed them to reflect on these experiences more fully and from a safe distance.
Emma, would you be able to tell me, from an educational perspective, how did you use it in that context?
Well, in terms of an educational context, I used NRP in a 30-minute facilitated discussion during a leadership and education course in my MN program. From our class learning style assessment, I knew the group was composed of overwhelmingly reflective learners, and I was assigned the topic of implementing curriculum redesign. I asked the audience to reflect on their biggest fears, worries, and concerns about such a task. Then I asked them to write a story about a time they successfully planned and launched something, anything, an event, a plan, a workshop, either personally or professionally. I asked them to note what they thought at the time, how it felt, bodily sensations, and how they knew it had been a success. Later, I invited them to draw a metaphor of themselves in that moment. Who were they in that story? How would they depict themselves metaphorically? Then, I asked them to describe the characteristics of their metaphor and to reflect on whether those words also apply to themselves. Finally, I asked them to imagine the metaphor could talk. What advice would the metaphor have in response to the fears, worries, and concerns the participants identified at the start? I invited them to write a postcard to themselves from this metaphor. I provided envelopes, and the participants sealed the postcards off, post-dated to be opened at a date of their choosing. Participants overwhelmingly found the experience engaging, thought-provoking, creative, and an interesting use of arts-based learning. As a reflective group, the students enjoyed this approach to learning. It was appropriate to their style.
This sounds a really great experience. Thanks for sharing, Emma. Very inspiring, and it's really nice to see the steps of the process and the way you walked us through that. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Chantelle, how about you? Could you please share with us what's your experience with NRP?
Thank you, Ramona, for your question. My experience with the narrative reflective process is twofold. While enrolled in advanced therapeutic communication and simultaneously being Dr. Schwind's thesis student, I became familiar with the narrative reflective process. In a class exercise where we were invited to engage in a creative activity, it required us to select a metaphor that best represents who we are as self, as instruments of care. As well, I incorporated the narrative reflective process in my study, where I use arts-informed narrative inquiry. Through examining the scholarly literature, I recognized the value of incorporating the narrative reflective process in facilitating emotive learning. Co-participants in my study were invited to create a metaphor, drawing, or a poem that best represents for them their healthcare experience. Tapping into co-participants' hopes, dreams, and fears through engaging in the narrative reflective process illuminated new knowledge not previously visible in their told healthcare stories. Currently, I'm in the process of engaging healthcare leadership team at a community hospital in the narrative reflective process to facilitate a deeper understanding of what cultural safety looks like.
This is wonderful and sounds very exciting. I'm looking forward to hear more about it later on. Even for myself, being engaged with you and Emma in a self as instrument of care activity has been for me a wonderful journey. Following the NRP process allowed me to identify myself with an instrument as a metaphor to reflect on. I chose the saxophone in this case. It's still a work in progress for me. However, the drawings, the reflection, journaling about it, and trying to identify who I am as a person and also as a professional while I'm playing the saxophone has been a very deep and meaningful experience for me so far. How about you, Emma?
Well, it's funny, I reflect on our group meetings where the three of us also engage in NRP to explore who we are as instruments of care, self as instrument of care. And through our conversations and our reflective activities, I was really able to work on my metaphor of my professional self. And I think the reflections on my metaphor helped me evolve professionally, and it allowed me to let go of some old ways of thinking that I was holding on to. Using the NRP process, I was able to learn from my metaphor and allowing it to guide me to where I'm at now.
This is so beautiful. Moving on to the next question. What were some of the challenges in implementing NRP from your experiences, and how can those challenges be addressed? Maybe we can start with Dr. Schwind.
Thank you, Ramona. So from my experience, the challenges for implementing narrative reflective process include mainly time, the number of participants, and participants' willingness to engage in creative activities. The process is time consuming. It does take time. It requires introspection and reflection. So the way I usually deal with these challenges is that I first consider my audience. What is the purpose of using NRP, and how much time I have to engage the participants in the process? For example, a decade ago at a conference, I spoke to an audience of over 100 educators and researchers, and I had approximately 1 hour. So I used the metaphoric reflection piece of the NRP. I invited the audience to consider who they were as instruments of their respective professional roles. And then I guided them through the rest of the process. It is always an invitation and never a demand to engage people in creative self-expression activities. Creative work can quickly go very deep. And that is why I prefer to work with much smaller groups, to be able to stay watchful and to ensure everyone is staying safe, that no one is emotionally triggered by their own creative exploration or by shared stories of other group members. So creating a safe space is of utmost importance, and it is the leader's responsibility to create such a safe and invitational environment.
I really like that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Schwind. Chantelle, how about you?
It's a good question. My challenge with the narrative reflective process is learning how to effectively engage a group of multidisciplinary healthcare professionals in the creative process. Recently, I discussed the narrative reflective process with a clinical nurse specialist and an endocrinologist who both really actually liked the idea, recognizing the value. However, they both expressed feeling hesitant about their creative capacity, and that's a challenge.
Yes, I agree. It takes a little bit of time to access that area, but I feel like once they will do it, it will be great. So far, from my perspective, I haven't had the opportunity to apply NRP in my clinical practice. However, I intend to do so, and hopefully very soon. Some of the barriers that I anticipate may be perhaps limited time and space for reflection. some resistance from staff in opening up, being creative, just as you mentioned, Chantelle, and also as Dr. Schwind mentioned, allowing themselves to be vulnerable, that could be another one. So therefore, sharing some deep experiences may take time. Therefore, building trust and respect with participants is essential in this process while introducing and guiding the NRP process. It is important to make our staff participants aware that they are not alone in this journey. It is a dual journey where both parties have the opportunity to learn from each other while valuing their experience. And Emma, how about you? What are some challenges for you?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I think my biggest struggle is lack of confidence in my technical artistic skills. Yet I recognize that the beauty of NRP is that it really isn't about the artistic skills. It's about what is meaningful to the person who's drawing it. I found phrasing from Dr. Schwind's videos to be very helpful to orient the participant to the open nature of the activity. I would recite that or slightly alter it to suit my purposes. But really, I think creativity just purely for the sake of self-expression is somewhat rare. We're so used to being evaluated, and this is especially true in a research setting. In my facilitation, one student reported feeling frustrated by the drawing process because they weren't an aesthetic learner. It isn't for everyone, and that's okay. Offering opt-outs is important, and showing some shared vulnerability and humanity really goes a long way. Staying present with the person, respecting their work, and providing supportive encouragement also helps. It's an ongoing learning process for both the facilitator and the participant.
100%. That's true. And thanks so much for sharing that. Dr. Schwind, in terms of NRP, what advice would you give us as future educators, researchers, and practitioners?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank all three of you for being interested in this work, for sharing your experiences, and for giving your time to be here. So thank you for that. I think that bringing forth creative ways to develop knowing will serve humanity well. Through mindful presence and creative self-expression, we connect not only with our own humanity, but with that of others. This in turn supports relational person-centered practice in any discipline. So the important thing to keep in mind is to begin with ourselves, being present in the moment, being open to the creativity, to what emerges, to create safe space where those you are leading through the process can feel safe and supported. And please remember that this is not therapy. NRP serves to support knowledge development, whether it is in education, research, or practice, or in personal life. It is knowing that is intended to create a fuller, more meaningful life for all of us.
Thank you so much. This is so beautifully said, Dr. Schwind. Emma, Chantelle, would you like to add anything further?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting me to share my experiences with using the narrative reflective process. If anyone has any questions about using NRP in research, please feel free to reach out to me.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much as well. And Chantelle?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to discuss my experiences utilizing the narrative reflective process. I'm happy to discuss NRP with anybody who's interested in learning more about facilitating the approach and from my personal experiences with it. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Dr. Schwind and Emma and Chantelle, for sharing with me your stories and experiences about NRP. What an inspiring conversation. Like a real pleasure to learn with you, and it's been much appreciated. Thank you so much again. Our contact emails and a reference list about the use of the narrative reflective process follows this conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.